In July 2006, the British Army published a document about itself that it didn't expect anyone outside the Army to read. The document is called Operation Banner, an analysis of military operations in Northern Ireland, Army Code 71842. It opens with a foreword by General Sir Mike Jackson, at that moment the Chief of the General Staff, the most senior officer in the British Army. And it describes its own purpose plainly. Not a history, not a press release, not a public inquiry. A study. 3 officers were seconded from their normal duties for 6 months to produce it. They read hundreds of unit post-operational tour reports and several thousand other documents. They spoke to a number of retired or serving senior officers who had served in Northern Ireland. The result was approximately 100 pages of institutional self-examination, written at the end of the longest continuous deployment in the British Army's history. That deployment ran from 14th August 1969 to 31st of July 2007. 37 years and 11 months. Well over 250,000 regular Army soldiers served in it, along with tens of thousands more in the Ulster Defence Regiment and its successor, the Royal Irish Regiment, the document's own figures. More than 700 soldiers died or were killed by terrorist action. The worst single year was 1972, when 102 British soldiers died, more than in any year since Korea. At the peak of that same summer, 28,000 troops were deployed across a region roughly 80 miles wide and 120 miles long, with a population of about 1.8 million. The document's conditions of release page is unambiguous. No material contained in it should be reproduced or transmitted outside Ministry of Defence establishments without authorisation. It was written for British officers, by British officers, with no public audience to address and no political case to make. Which is what makes the comment underneath one of this channel's own videos worth taking seriously. That video was called "The Secret British Unit That Made the IRA Look Like Amateurs Inside the Debt." The top comment, 33 likes, 10 replies, the most agreed with thing anyone posted on that page, quoted this Army document back at the title. The commenter cited Richard English's Armed Struggle, The History of the IRA, published by Macmillan in 2003, and Tim Pat Coogan's The IRA, both unprompted. The argument, compressed, the title is wrong, and here is the Army's own internal paperwork proving it. They were right. The more interesting question is what the paperwork does after that. Army Code 71842 belongs to a specific genre of military publication. It isn't a government white paper. It isn't an official history. It isn't the product of a public inquiry. It's what armies produce when a long operation is winding down and somebody senior wants to ensure that what was learned does not disappear when the people who learned it retire. The stated aim is direct: to record the major lessons from British military operations in Northern Ireland since 1969 in order to guide future commanders and staff officers. Mike Jackson's foreword describes Operation Banner as one of the most important campaigns ever fought by the British Army and one of the very few ever brought to a successful conclusion by the armed forces of a developed nation against an irregular force. That word, conclusion, is doing a lot of work. The document's own Chapter 8, its major findings and conclusions, revisits that framing in a way that significantly complicates it. But the foreword also establishes something important about the document's purpose. It's intended to stimulate thought. The instruction to future readers is explicit. The publication will have failed if whatever is written is slavishly and unthinkingly applied to future operations. That is the genre. An institution talking to itself about what it learned, assuming no outsider would read it. One academic source, published by Springer, describes the document as riddled with inaccuracies, though the specific errors aren't itemized in the materials available here. The Pat Finucane Center, the human rights organization that obtained a copy under the Freedom of Information Act and published it in July 2007, called it deeply flawed and described it as betraying a profoundly colonial mindset towards the conflict. Both reactions matter, but they are downstream from what the document actually says, which is where the story is. Chapter 3 of Army Code 71842 deals with the protagonists of the conflict. It describes the 4 phases of Operation Banner and the organizations operating in each. About the provisional IRA, at the point where the text moves from the insurgency phase of the early 1970s into the longer campaign that followed, the document reaches its most quoted passage. The exact wording, as it appears on the page, IRA developed into what will probably be seen as one of the most effective terrorist organizations in history. Professional, dedicated, highly skilled and resilient, it conducted a sustained and lethal campaign in Northern Ireland, mainland United Kingdom, and on the continent of Europe. That is a single sentence, not 4 words scattered across different sections. A continuous assessment written in the past tense by officers who had spent 37 years on the other side of it. Take the words in order. Professional. From the early 1970s, the IRA had a conventional structure: companies, battalions, brigades, recognizable hierarchy. Security force operations and informer penetration had repeatedly dismantled it. From late 1973, the Belfast Brigade, under Ivor Bell, began experimenting with small, clandestine, active service units of 4 to 10 people. Between 1976 and 1978, the transformation became organization-wide. Northern Command and Southern Command were created. The traditional battalion and company structure was dissolved into cells with specialized roles: bombing, sniping, intelligence, internal security, logistics. A 1979 British government analysis drawn from Northern Ireland Office documents, now held at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, noted that since early 1977 the Provisionals had reorganised their terrorist structure, explicitly recording the adoption of a cellular system in place of the old chain of command. A separate British government assessment from 1983 described a major reshaping in 1977, driven by disaffection with indiscriminate violence and increased informing. The logic of compartmentalization is straightforward. Members of one cell don't know the names or locations of members of another. Information stays local. Weapons are controlled by brigade quartermasters rather than individual cells. A security breach in one unit can't cascade through the whole network. The IRA applied this doctrine systematically over a period of years. The organization also maintained what it called the Internal Security Unit, known to security forces by a bleaker name, the Nutting Squad. The name came from the method. Suspected informers were interrogated, and if the Army Council ratified a death sentence, they were shot in the head. The ISU was responsible for vetting recruits, investigating suspected penetrations, and carrying out executions after IRA courts-martial. It sat directly under the Army Council and Northern Command. The unit's most notorious alleged operative, Freddie Scappaticci, codenamed Steak Knife by British intelligence, was later identified as a long-running agent of the Force Research Unit, embedded inside the ISU itself from approximately the late 1970s. Operation Canova, the subsequent inquiry, connected him to 14 murders and 15 kidnappings during that time. The organisation survived his presence inside it for decades because there was no way to reach it from outside. On financing, Noraid raised funds from the Irish-American diaspora throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Domestic operations, robberies, extortion, smuggling across the border, provided the larger ongoing revenue. After the Libyan arms channel was disrupted, smuggling was described in security assessments as the most lucrative single source of income. Fuel, cigarettes, counterfeit goods, racketeering, front businesses. The PIRA wasn't improvising year to year. It was operating a sustained revenue model that kept an armed organisation functional for nearly 4 decades. Professional isn't a compliment in this context. It's a threat assessment. Dedicated. The campaign lasted 37 years. Somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 people passed through the IRA's ranks across the duration, by estimates that include those from Republican figures who served in it. By 1988, academic literature drawing on conflict records records that over 10,000 people had been imprisoned at some point during the campaign. The hunger strikes of 1981, 10 deaths between May and August, didn't break the organisation. They transformed its political strategy, accelerated Sinn Féin's development as an electoral force, and generated a cohort of committed volunteers who understood exactly what membership could cost. The PIRA's 2005 statement, formally ending the armed campaign, opens by declaring that the leadership of Óglaich na hÉireann has formally ordered an end to the armed campaign, and that there is an alternative way to achieve its objectives. The framing is of strategic choice, not exhaustion. Highly skilled. The PIRA maintained a dedicated engineering department located primarily in the Republic of Ireland, responsible for mixing homemade explosives, designing detonating systems, and standardizing timing and power units. Successive generations of devices were sufficiently uniform that British security forces classified them in a Mark series, each version numbered sequentially. The Mk-15 mortar, developed in 1992, became known as the Barrack Buster. Truck-mounted, capable of defeating fortified positions, the endpoint of approximately 20 years of iterative engineering development. That isn't sporadic improvisation. That is an arms program. Between 1985 and 1986, 4 Libyan shipments delivered approximately 150 tons of materiel to the PIRA, including 3 to 4 tons of Semtex plastic explosive. Semtex's stability, power, and ease of concealment made it the standard component in PIRA devices from that point. Virtually every significant bomb in the late 1980s incorporated it. The October 1987 seizure of the Exund intercepted a 5th Libyan shipment off Brittany, but the 4 earlier deliveries had already moved the materiel. Security assessments in 1990 still recorded huge stocks in PIRA quartermaster stores. When external Semtex supply finally dried up, the engineering department adapted, developing homemade explosive mixes of increasing sophistication through the 1990s. The arms race adjusted. It didn't stop. Resilient. On the 8th of May 1987, an 8-man East Tyrone Brigade unit attacked the RUC station at Loch Gall in County Armagh. They arrived with a mechanical digger carrying a bomb of over 200 pounds of Semtex and a support van of gunmen. The SAS, together with RUC officers, had been waiting. In the ambush that followed, Operation Judy, all 8 PIRA attackers were killed. The organization's greatest single loss of life in one incident during the entire conflict, described in some accounts as its biggest tactical defeat since the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 1921. The PIRA leadership resolved to continue. Further attacks followed. Less than 10 months later, on the 6th of March 1988, SAS soldiers shot dead 3 PIRA members, Mairead Farrell, Sean Savage and Daniel McCann, in Gibraltar during Operation Flavius. Explosives were subsequently found in a Ford Fiesta in Marbella, approximately 132 pounds of Semtex plus ammunition. The European Court of Human Rights later ruled the operation planning had violated Article 2 of the Convention, though the Gibraltar inquest found the killings lawful. The funerals in Belfast were themselves scenes of further violence. The organisation didn't pause. Stakeknife operated at the heart of PIRA's own internal security apparatus for the better part of 2 decades. The organisation survived even that. The document calls this resilience. It's describing an organisation that absorbed catastrophic losses in personnel, in intelligence, in materiel, and continued to function. Not without damage, without collapse. A few pages from the PIRA assessment, the document turns to the loyalist paramilitaries. The characterization is substantially different. According to multiple press and secondary sources quoting the document, loyalist paramilitaries, and here the text extends the description to other non-provisional Republican formations as well, are described as little more than a collection of gangsters. That scope matters. The document appears to be applying this characterization to loyalists and to smaller Republican splinter groups, not exclusively to loyalists. The Pat Finucane Centre, in their July 2007 statement, actually paraphrased the document differently, using the word respectable rather than gangsters, which suggests the document's treatment of loyalism may be more layered than any single summary captures. The primary text requires careful examination for full precision. But the broad conclusion from Irish Times reporting, from the Scala Forum reproduction of the PFC statement, and from Wikipedia's provisional IRA article, all of which quote the document in this context, is consistent. The Army's assessment of loyalist paramilitaries sits far below its assessment of the provisional IRA. The factual basis for that distinction isn't difficult to establish. By the mid-1990s, an estimated 60% of Northern Ireland's drug trade had come under the control of loyalist paramilitaries, according to academic literature citing Andrew Silker's research from 2000. The UDA and UVF were embedded in extortion, racketeering, and the control of drinking clubs, gaming machines, and black taxis across loyalist Belfast. A 2015 PSNI assessment for the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland recorded that the UVF still had members extensively involved in organised crime, including drug dealing, extortion, and smuggling. A government minister confirmed on the floor of the House of Commons in April 2007 that gangsterism and remnants of paramilitary activity among loyalist groups, including the UDA, are still unacceptable. These are post-conflict assessments, but they document patterns established during it. On structure, loyalist groups retained more open, territorially based brigade organisations with weaker compartmentalisation than the PIRA. They never implemented the cell-based security architecture the Provisionals had developed between 1973 and 1977. Targeting was more indiscriminate. Loyalists were responsible for roughly 30% of total Troubles fatalities, with civilian casualties forming a high proportion of that total. The De Silva report, examining the 1980s, found that 85% of the intelligence loyalists used to target people came from security force sources. A counter-argument exists and should be stated. The UVF's 1994 ceasefire decision, timed in coordination with the PIRAs, demonstrates a degree of political calculation that a simple gangster characterization underestimates. Loyalists killed approximately 1,000 people over the course of the conflict. They weren't a marginal actor. But the Army's document isn't making a moral comparison. It's making a threat assessment. And the assessments aren't symmetric. That asymmetry tells you what the Army understood the war to be. The Provisional IRA was the strategic opponent, the organization requiring specialist surveillance units, intensive intelligence investment, dedicated counter-terrorism coordination, decades of signals intelligence and agent running. The Loyalists were, in the Army's own framing, something closer to a criminal policing problem, severe but not requiring the same category of strategic response. The document, notably, makes no mention of alleged British Army collusion with Loyalist paramilitaries. The Stevens inquiries, 3 investigations between 1989 and 2003, found that collusion did occur. Whether the Army's lower strategic assessment of loyalism contributed to lower oversight of that arena is a reasonable inference from what the document contains. The document does not answer that question. It simply illustrates the gap between the 2 threat assessments and leaves the structural implication visible. The document's conclusion on the outcome of the campaign appears in Chapter 8, Major Findings, Overview and Conclusions. The passage, reproduced verbatim in the Blanket's analysis of the document and identifiable within Section 8 of Army Code 71842. It should be recognized that the Army didn't win in any recognizable way. Rather, it achieved its desired end state, which allowed a political process to be established without unacceptable levels of intimidation. Security force operations suppressed the level of violence to a level which the population could live with, and with which the RUC and, later, the PSNI could cope. The violence was reduced to an extent which made it clear to the PIRA that they wouldn't win through violence. This is a major achievement, and one with which the security forces from all 3 services, with the Army in the lead, should be entirely satisfied. Desired end state isn't casual language. It's standard British Army operational planning terminology, the condition to be achieved at the close of an operation. The document is saying, in doctrinal terms, that the Army reached its objective. It's also saying, in plain terms, that winning was never defined as the military annihilation of the Provisional IRA. 3 readings of that paragraph have circulated since the document became public, and none of them is simply wrong. The Republican reading first. Anne Foblacht's headline in July 2007, Operation Banner, British Army didn't and couldn't defeat the IRA. The document calls the IRA professional, skilled and resilient, then acknowledges the Army didn't defeat it. From that perspective, the document is the British state conceding what Republicans had long maintained. What Republicans tend not to quote is the surrounding framing, that the Army asserts it achieved its desired end state, that violence was suppressed to tolerable levels, that it became clear to the PIRA that force wouldn't deliver its objectives. The document positions the Army as having structured the conditions in which a political settlement became possible. Republicans dispute that characterization of the peace process. The veteran and unionist reading. The Irish Times described the document as being ridiculed by a number of seasoned commentators for its congratulatory tone despite ending in stalemate. Describing 37 years of operations, over 600 soldier deaths, and the absence of a military victory as a major achievement, strikes many veterans as institutional self-justification dressed in doctrinal language. The academic M.L.R. Smith has argued that the 1994 ceasefire marked the strategic failure of the Provisional IRA because it failed to achieve its stated goal of a 32-county socialist republic. Stalemate, in that reading, means the IRA failed, which makes the four words a particular kind of insult to those who served. The doctrinal reading. Classical counterinsurgency theory has never defined success as the military annihilation of an insurgent force. Frank Kitson's Low-Intensity Operations, published in 1971 and foundational to British Army thinking on irregular warfare, frames the objective as creating conditions for a political settlement, not the elimination of the enemy in the field. The Army's language in Chapter 8 is entirely consistent with this framework. Desired end state. Conditions for a political process. The document isn't confessing failure. It's describing, in the terms of its own professional doctrine, what it understands success in this category of conflict to mean. These three readings can't all be accurate about what actually happened, but each is an accurate reading of what the document says and what it declines to say. Contained into negotiation and conditions for settlement sound similar but carry different weight. The first implies coercion. The PIRA was cornered and had no real choice. The second implies management. The army created space for politics to work without determining what politics would conclude. The document uses the second framing. Gerry Adams described the outcome as a political and military stalemate. The 2005 IRA statement frames the transition as strategic choice. Two organizations, each writing its own version of the outcome, each declining to say the other won. Almost nobody quotes all of this in the same breath, and the pattern of selective quotation is itself the argument. Republicans cite the four words and the "didn't win" passage. Veterans and Unionists object to the four words and invoke the Army's claim of ultimate success. Neither side typically quotes the loyalist assessment in the same sentence as the PIRA assessment, which is precisely where the Army's conceptual model of the conflict becomes legible. Not two mirrored communal militias, one strategic opponent, one criminal and public order problem. That distinction shapes everything downstream: resource allocation, intelligence priorities, the architecture of oversight, and the controversies that persist from its absence. The Pat Finucane Center's statement called the document a profoundly colonial mindset and said that loyalist violence and the links between loyalist paramilitaries and the state has been airbrushed out of this military history, prepared under the direction of the Chief of the General Staff. The Center named Mike Jackson specifically, noting his role on Bloody Sunday in 1972. They demanded the document be withdrawn. It remains in circulation. Some academic literature finds inaccuracies within it. Veterans find its tone self-congratulatory. Republicans find its framing of the peace process self-serving. The document manages to irritate almost everyone who reads it carefully, which is probably a decent sign that it is saying something. The comment underneath this channel's debt video cited Richard English and Tim Pat Coogan. Both are serious historians who spent years on this subject. English's Armed Struggle runs to nearly 500 pages and draws on interviews with participants across all sides. Coogan's The IRA has been through multiple editions since 1970. Using those sources to push back on a title that implied the IRA were operationally negligible was a legitimate intervention, and the commenter was right that the Army's own internal document supported the pushback. The accusations sometimes made against this channel, that examining the provisional IRA's tactical and organizational effectiveness constitutes sympathy with the organization, mistakes analysis for endorsement. The four words were written by British officers. The assessment belongs to the institution that fought the campaign. This channel's previous video title made a claim about relative competence. The claim was worth testing, and the document is the test. Army Code 71842 is publicly available. The Pat Finucane Centre's FOI request is the reason. What the document does, in total, is put two assessments inside the same text and then conclude with a passage about what 37 years of operations achieved. The Provisional IRA, professional, dedicated, highly skilled and resilient, one of the most effective terrorist organizations in history. Loyalist paramilitaries and other non-provisional formations, little more than a collection of gangsters. The campaign, not won in any recognizable way, but achieving a desired end state that allowed a political process to function. Both sides of this argument have spent 20 years quoting one half of that document at each other. The closing observation is this: when a professional military institution calls an enemy professional, it's making a claim about the quality of the fight it was in. An army that spent 37 years battling an organization it believed to be incompetent would have produced a different document, one that was embarrassed by the length rather than measured about the difficulty. The army chose these forewords in private for internal institutional purposes, with no political benefit attached to doing so. That is their weight. This isn't vindication of the Provisional IRA's campaign. The organization killed roughly 1,700 people over 37 years. Bombs in commercial centers, proxy bombings, sectarian shootings, the murders of suspected informers, civilians killed in operations that went wrong, and civilians killed in operations that went exactly as planned. Capability and morality are separate questions. The document addresses only one of them. The honest account of what Operation Banner achieved is in the document's own language. The army made it clear to the PIRA that it wouldn't win through violence. The PIRA made it clear to the army that it couldn't be militarily defeated. Both ran out of things they could force. The politicians finished the job. Whether that is an honest institutional reckoning with 37 years or a careful retrospective framing designed to avoid saying the army didn't win, that is the question the document puts on the table and then declines to answer. Every word in Chapter 8 was chosen deliberately, just as every word in the 2005 IRA statement was. Two institutions, each writing its own version of what it had been doing, finding that the honest answer looked the same from both sides, holding on until the politicians were ready. The document is in the description. If this is the kind of history you want to follow, subscribe.